Advanced Perspectives, a new podcast from Affect Autism.
Welcome, listeners. This is Daria Brown, and this week I have a returning guest, Michelle Abraham-Montgomery, who specializes in family services, autism resources and advocacy, peer family coaching, peer best practices, modeling play therapy techniques, and IEP reviews and preparations. Her and her autistic son, Kylil, who we podcasted with last year, and who will be presenting at ICDL's upcoming in-person conference in New York City in March, created Spectrum Success 911, a nonprofit organization connecting families with community resources and organizations of support in the Philadelphia area. She also provides programming and resources, including autistic ambassadors and a virtual support group called the Awesome Movement, and others as well. What don't you do, Shell? Shell is now the supportive glam mom of an autistic grandson as well. And today we will be discussing navigating advocacy from the backseat and all of the different support roles that we play. Welcome back, Shell. It's great to have you.
Thank you. I am super excited to be here.
Well, I'm not only excited about our podcast, but I'm super excited that you and Kylil will be at the upcoming International Council on Development and Learning's DIR conference in New York City in March.
Yes.
Because there is somewhat of an international audience for Affect Autism and the We Chose Play podcast, I did want to specify, in case any of you aren't up on the pop culture of North America, I did just listen to a really cool podcast the other day interviewing Sheila E. about the song The Glamorous Life. And so if anybody didn't know, what the heck are they talking about glam mom? Glam is short for glamorous, and Shell is a lovely, glamorous person. So I just wanted to throw that out there because if someone's listening from, maybe some country that they're like, what the heck is glam? What's a glam mom? I just had to say it's short for glamorous. And yes, do you remember that pop song with Prince,
Yes.
Glamorous
Yes,
Life?
absolutely. That's awesome.
Yeah, so I just wanted to specify that. We already covered all the stuff you do in our past podcast. For listeners that haven't heard it, if you're on YouTube, go down to the link underneath in the description. In the blog post for today's podcast, it links back to the other podcasts I've done with Shell and with her son Kylil. But today, we want to dive a little bit further in to some of the topics that you alluded to in our Parent Perspectives podcast with the other parents when we had our panel discussion. You mentioned, I'm a glam mom now. I have a grandson who's autistic. I went through this with my son, but my daughter now has an autistic son, and I don't want to step on her toes and tell her what to do, and I want to advocate from the backseat. So tell us about this experience. First of all, how old is your grandson?
2. He's 2 years old. He'll be 3 actually this year in May. And so the beauty of everything the second time around, right, as the glam mom, is identifying the behaviors that I didn't recognize with Kylil, right? So different things like those, when he wants those deep hugs and he'll come in and do things where before I didn't know what Kylil was doing. And now having those aha moments just like really makes my heart smile to be able to recognize and identify the behaviors because he's just starting to have some verbiage, but a lot of things are nonverbal cues. And so being able to identify those cues now is just amazing. It's awesome. And we spell it AUSOME, right?
That's right. It must just be such a different experience because in the We Chose Play documentary, which you watched, you saw that, the first time around, the parents usually are filled with this despair and gloom, and you described your story with Kylil and just feeling almost helpless, hopeless, and now the second time around, you sort of can see a bit of the future, and like you said, you're seeing all these cues and these behaviors, and they're not scary anymore like they were to you the first time.
And so I share with parents about the phases of acceptance begins with rejection. And so in the beginning, when a lot of parents have a hard time accepting that their child has a diagnosis. And then, you come to the acceptance phase, we call it. And then after that acceptance, you can get to embracing. And this is part of my embracement phase of our journey because um I didn't have a hard time with accepting that Khalil has some developmental delays, and autism didn't come into our journey until he was about 10, maybe 12, early tweens. But with that, we accepted that and we were able to move forward and allow him to thrive. But now with my grandson, I am really, really embracing our journey. So yeah, I'm loving it.
So it must be interesting for your daughter because she had Khalil as a sibling and now she has a son. And so are you finding that she is where you are in the embracing stage, but she's going through it as a mother for the first time? So how do you relate with watching what she's going through and understanding her journey, which is different than yours?
Well, she has come in and gained her crown from the very start as an awesome mom. Just listening to her with services and different things saying, I remember this with Khalil. And she just came in and just like she won. She's winning from the beginning. And so there are a few things that she may come and she may ask, for advice, but that's one of the key parts of navigating from the back seat is allowing her the opportunity to have that space to come and ask opposed to pushing information on her. And so just listening to her speak and engage with the services for my grandson really allows me to see how much she really was paying attention. And she's the baby of the family. And so I even, speak about that. Maybe we can do another podcast about um not changing the roles of the siblings because I actually changed her role from the baby and made her a co-caretaker of Khalil, unbeknownst to what I was doing at that time. But now that I've realized it, because it was always make sure your brother is okay, make sure Khalil is this. And so she became the big, sibling opposed to the baby. And so with that, now I'm really seeing how much she was paying attention and how much she really absorbed everything that was going on with her brother.
I mean, that's incredible. And it must give you some sense of, I guess, validation for the things that you did and the supports that you provided, because we know that you were key warrior mom from the red carpet podcast that we did. So she had a great role model for sure. But being the role model that you are, and not just being a mother to Khalil, but you've now helped so many families and you advocate for them and you've met so many other people and you're such a support to your community. You must have to maybe bite your tongue sometimes. And so talk about that experience when you are navigating from the back seat, because you mentioned how she will do things and you're watching and you're saying, wow, she really learned a lot. But what about when maybe she isn't catching things that you see? How do you navigate that?
So now it's very interesting, Daria, because of social media, and that wasn't as prevalent back then as it is now. And so when there's some things going on, I'm like waiting, they're waiting and thinking I'm excited that she's gonna come and ask me, and she'll say, oh yeah, I'm gonna go on TikTok and ask the reviewers like what their thinks and thoughts are. And I'm like, you're gonna go on TikTok and I have an organization like, but I have to respect her space and her place now. And as the mom, it says, okay, well, let me know how that works out. And then you also have to, in a loving way, be there with that safety net when she comes and says, "Oh, I was so upset because they said some really mean things and they did this and they did that." And so allowing them to have that space to be able to make their own errors. Don't say, "Why would you do that?" They're going to eat you alive on there. No, you have to stay in your lane and just be supporting, right? Stay in that supporting lane and then wait when they come bruised a little bit sometimes and brush them up with love, right?
Yes, and that is probably way easier said than done.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I found that, trying to keep that poker face, oh my goodness. Yeah, it's still a skill I'm trying to master.
So, what is it like interacting with your grandson? You mentioned seeing those cues and loving, understanding the behavior this time around. How has that experience been?
Wow. So in the beginning, and even with the oldest grandchild, I had to learn then when the grandmom comes in the room and the children, they're just like running to the grandparent. They love the grandparents. And it seemed like my daughter would shrink, you know, and because it was always her, she was my baby. And now my attention is drawn to her babies. And so in the beginning, I would hear, the baby would run over to me and she was like, "Why are you running for her?" I'm like, "Wait a minute, what's going on?" And so from there, I had to learn when I come in, first and foremost, address my daughter. I'm going to love her first and then go to the grandchildren because a lot of times, as parents, especially when we transition to grandparents, our children, and I'm seeing a lot of TikTok videos now, and I just seen one said that grandparents are fake. Oh, we got beef for everything. And then when the grandchildren do it, they make excuses and it's allowed. And so we don't want to dismiss or make our children feel invisible once the grandchildren come. So I try to be very cognizant to make sure that my daughter still stays my baby first and foremost.
This must be such an intentional process because it's probably not something that just comes naturally. If you're naturally wanting to run to your grandchildren, give them the big hug and kiss, you have to be very intentional about it.
So the one thing that I would do if they run to me first, then we'll do a group hug. I'll pick them up and then I'll go and hug her with them, right? Just to make so that she doesn't feel like she's being dismissed or she's invisible.
I love that you have the insight into how you are being received from your family members. How did that come about that you had those realizations?
I just know for myself, coming from a, I don't even know if I want to say dysfunctional, because I think that my parents did the best they could with what they had. And I believe that my mom was undiagnosed bipolar, and I do see some of those behaviors in my daughter and even some of those manic sessions in myself. And so now that I'm aware of the behaviors and of the language, then now I can say, okay, yeah, looking back, I can see why she did what she did or why I do what I do. And even with my daughter, seeing the behaviors and being able to separate the behavior from the child, loving her unconditionally, and then learning how to cope and teaching her coping skills for her diagnosis. And so growing up, we lived with multiple family members, my siblings and I. And for some time we were separated. And I remember at a young age feeling invisible, feeling like I was not loved. And so, but then as I got older and educated, I realized that I believe my parents did the best that they could with what they had at the time. I can count on one hand how many times my mother says she loved me. I don't think that she didn't, but I don't know that she knew how to, because I'm not sure about her background, about her relationship with her mothers. And so I speak a lot about breaking these cycles of generational behaviors that are passed down, and starting new ones is what I had to do with my own daughter, from that. And so it was hard, but it was necessary. I've I've never received an apology from my mother before she passed. And I shared the story about the last 6 months of my mother's life was the best 6 months of mine because I was finally seen. She saw me. My mother, she was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. And so um at that time she wanted to draw close to, and she gave us so many gems. And we'll talk about that a little bit later about collecting those gems, and then when your time comes, being able to now recite them back and give that to your children and grandchildren growing up. And that's so important. And so now, and I saw that with my mother. She would tell my daughter and my son how much she loved them all the time. And I'm like, but wait, you didn't love me. You never said it to me. And so from that, I was able to say, okay, I'm not going to repeat that. I'm going to make sure that my children know and hear that, and see that I love them.
It's so interesting. Dr. Ira Glavinsky talks about the ghosts in the nursery. So when parents are interacting with their children, he'll see them do certain things, and he says it's not just you there, it's the ghosts of your parents and their parents and their parents and those cycles. And I think that comes from her last name is Freiberg. I think Selma Freiberg is who came up with that, and I can link to that in the blog post. And in Floor Time and DIR, we talk about presuming competence, and I love how you presumed competence in that self-reflection, the ninth functional emotional and developmental capacity, in reflecting on your parents and their ability to do the best that they could do, and just having that maturity and wisdom to accept and move forward, and like you said, really help support the families that you work with to not repeat cycles that carrying that pain and hurt, and really expressing the support and love for the next generation. So I love all that. That's amazing.
Thank you.
I love how you talked about as well. I think it was in the last podcast, and if it wasn't in the last podcast, it might have been in our ICDL's parent support virtual meeting. So forgive me, listeners, if it's not in the past podcast, if you're hearing this for the first time, and forgive me if we're repeating it again, but you talked about reflecting in a therapy session about wearing the different hats. And so having a certain experience and realizing that, wait a second, I'm wearing a different hat. Can you go into that and describe that again?
Oh my goodness. So as a peer professional and now supervisor, we wear a lot of hats. And so as I'm working with peers, I'm sharing my story. And the same way, with a therapist, that families, individuals will share their information with you. And as they are venting, and now you are taking on, they're releasing it and they're giving it to you. And it's so important in this line of work that we ourselves have a support person, because when they give it to us, we don't want to hold on to that. We want to be able to expel that and pass it on. And that cycle should continue of passing that baton. And so I was talking to my therapist, and I was feeling like at that time, I was like, I'm hearing voices. I'm losing my mind. Like, what is going on? And I shared this with my therapist. And she has said to me, well, Shell, the next time you hear these voices, because I was trying to block them out, dismiss them. She said, when you hear it, get a recorder and just start saying what you hear or writing it down. And that's what I did. And what I came to realize is that during conversations, depending on if I'm working as a system partner, as I'm working as a mom, as a resource person, that I am talking to someone else about whatever we're talking about. And then another hat will in the background step in and give the answer to that resource. And when I actually listened with my therapist, we listened to what I was hearing. Someone was asking about resources for a family, and the information that was being given to me was that resource information. And we both, my therapist and I, were like in tears. She was like, "You are amazing, phenomenal, and this is a gift. Don't shut it out," because it was scaring me, and I was trying to dismiss it, and I was trying to um push it down, suppress it. And now it's just amazing that in the line of work that I do, that as like I'm talking to you and we're talking about things, my brain is constantly working and information comes. And sometimes I always like to keep like a pen and paper nearby, so when I start hearing these things, I can start jotting down notes, so that way, out of respect for the speaker, giving them their time to talk, when my time comes, I can recall that information and I can share what was shared with me.
And I guess that's kind of what you were talking about too with your daughter, because you might have the mom hat saying, "Oh, he's just trying to do this. Don't do this with him, or bring him here, or do this." But then you realize, wait a sec, I'm in my glam mom hat right now. So I'm going to step back, let her have that dignity of risk, is a term I recently heard, and let her do that. And I will just keep my glam mom hat on. Or similarly, when you're working as a peer counselor or supporting families, you probably have different hats, having ideas about things, but not necessarily wanting to step on their toes, or sometimes realizing they might need something from you that might be from a different hat, and where all the different boundaries are. That must be something that you've really had practice in navigating.
Yes, learning how to respect spaces, especially during conversation, is something that we had to do during like mock sessions with both my son and my daughter. And allowing them and teaching them to write down your thoughts when you have it, so that when your turn comes, because a lot of times people say, "Oh, when you talk to autistic people, they don't give you a chance to talk, they'll just keep going on and on and on." And so it's important to also teach them, have those mock sessions, the importance of sharing. And that's a skill in a conversation, like a dialogue. It's your turn, then your turn. And I kind of even use like the illustration of ping pong with that, and we'll play ping pong and say, like when the ball comes to you, it's your turn, then you hit it and pass it back. But I'm waiting, I'm thinking about my move. If ball comes different ways, how am I going to position myself to hit it? And that's the same way it works with a conversation. So teaching them those skills are very important.
Yes, and it's funny. Dr. Glavinsky also, Ira, he said, always tells me, call me Ira. He said that he also used that analogy of the ping pong. I'll have to refer back to the blog post where he talks about that too, more in the context, I think, of back and forth interaction when our children are learning to communicate. But of course, we're always monitoring our own FEDCs, functional emotional developmental capacities. If we're in a different headspace, we might not be available for that back and forth as well.
Even now with peer coaching, teaching and empowering people that how to set boundaries, right? That people treat you the way that you teach them and allow them to. That when someone pushes, it's okay to push back, to say, yeah, no, we're not going to do that. Thank you, but no, thank you. And now you set the boundary, because when they push, if you don't set that boundary, then they'll push again further because they're going to set the boundary. So learning how to set your boundaries opposed to others setting the boundary for you.
Is that something that you also do in your workshops with the young adults?
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely, definitely. Yes. And that's part of our navigating safe and healthy relationships.
Yes, and I know you gave examples of, really having conversations with Kylil around that as well to make sure that he understands about navigating
Yes.
that and that how important that is for our young kids, especially when they are at the place when they're older. A lot of people listening might have younger children, but those younger children will be young adults one day, and they may be very communicative and social with others. And it's something that you don't think about when your kid is 2, 3, and you don't know if they're ever going to get there. And seeing the future and having that hope, when we see people like Kylil and others, whatever the future looks like for them, they're going to have to navigate social relationships and the importance of self-advocating and setting those boundaries and all of those important safety issues.
Absolutely. And even, with Khalil now, he'll be 30 this year,
Yeah.
teaching him, and I should say them, on how to date intentionally, especially when there are diagnoses involved. You have to be very intentional about dating. It's because what you don't want to do is trigger each other. And then if you do, knowing how to support and help to first self de-escalate and then help to support and de-escalate your partner. So being very intentional and cognizant of what that looks like and having those discussions before it actually happens. So taking those preventive measures beforehand to do that. And even to share with Khalil when some of the challenges are identifying social cues is recognizing how to say no. A lot of time men are told, especially if a female is the aggressor, to oh, you take it, you do this, and as a guy, and the swag. But if you don't feel comfortable and a female is too aggressive for you, standing your ground and saying, I don't want to do that, I don't feel comfortable with you doing that. And it's okay, to say those things. So being able to stand your ground as a male and still have dignity and integrity afterwards is definitely a conversation and something that we had to discuss.
I really loved the example you shared with me privately about a conversation you had or support that you were giving, which you didn't share anything confidential, but you gave me an interesting story, which, you alluded to people saying that autistics, and of course this is overnight generalization, will talk nonstop and not let you get a word in. But you gave me an example of the opposite thing happening as well, which I thought was so interesting, where you were working with an autistic, I believe it was young adult or older teen, who wasn't communicating certain things, and the caretaker was making assumptions about it and not presuming competence, and you were able to meet that child or young adult where they were at, very DIR principle, meeting them where they're at and building that relationship and trust, so that you found out that the reason why the person wasn't drinking any water is they were worried about the filter on the water system not having been changed, and didn't want to drink unpure water or whatever, which is such a logical thing that people like. I'd be that way personally. Maybe some people don't care; they drink out of the tap. But I like to drink filtered water, and if I think the filter hasn't been changed, I might avoid that water. But how it can be perceived differently when we don't have those communications. So, well, that's the first part, and then I wanted to ask a follow up to that about how you do that in your groups with young autistic adults when you are having them share those kinds of things. Like you're not only telling them, have the ping pong back and forth and doing mock sessions, but also having them be able to advocate for themselves and be able to say, no, I'm not being defiant. There's a reason why. But a lot of times they'll keep that inside. And of course, we're overgeneralizing. We're just using this example.
So the first and foremost thing that I always share with parents is validation. Validation is so important, not just for adults, but also with our kiddos. So even if we don't see what they're saying, we want to validate what they are saying because, and even if it's not real, it's real to them. And we don't want to downplay what's going on with them. And so when the person we were talking about had shared about why they weren't eating or drinking, and it was some OCD situations about cleanliness, and I don't know whether they wash their hands, and those are all valid points. And so yes, and I gave an illustration, to say it's like when we go to a restaurant and we get a burger, we don't know if a fly landed on it or not. And even if the another person there's a burger and they saw the fly land on it and they still choose to eat it, it doesn't make one person right and one person wrong, or vice versa. But the thing is that if that is something that you or that bothers you, and I told him that, he was just super cognizant of things that were happening, where some people don't really pay attention to those smaller details. And he was just very, very cognizant of the small things. Well, the fly landing on my burger is not a small thing. To be honest. But for some people, they'll push it away and they want to eat their burger. I personally wouldn't do that, but to each his own preference. And just not making people feel, that their perspective of the way they want to do things is wrong. So we want to definitely be very intentional and cognizant of not shame, blaming, or judging others.
Yes, you brought that up in our first podcast, the shame, blame, judging. And I love all of these little gems. You were talking about gems. I love that. All these gems that I get from you because they they may be things that I've thought before, but you label them and describe them in a different way with a different lens, and then I'm like, oh, I get all these light bulb moments of
Thank
things that
you.
I go through every day. So
Those are my
I love
aha
it.
moments, right?
Yes, yes. And that's why it's so great to learn from each other. And I love doing this podcast because everybody shares the things that they see. And it just is so helpful in navigating our roles as advocates for our children, and in your case, for your grandchild, and in your case, for the families that you support. And in my case, at parent support meetings. And all of these things we're always learning through these relationships. So I value all of that so much, Michelle.
Even, staying in the backseat and, we maintaining our glam, it's so important to make sure that we don't want to become second parents, or that we don't want to it's not our responsibility to co-parent with our children. My responsibility as the glam mom is to love and support my grandson. Dale, it's your responsibility as the mom to discipline him. But I parent you and support you and love him. You parent him and I support you and your family. And that is so important, and I use the illustration again. I love illustrations of traffic light. And as long as we stay in our lane, we'll stay green. But when we start going into territory that's iffy, now we're in the yellow, which means proceed with caution. So if you're in that yellow zone and you want to still keep going and you hit a red, well, maybe you're in a space that you're not supposed to be in, right? So that yellow is that warning to say, am I in my lane? Am I maintaining my glam? you know? And I really have to be cognizant and start asking myself questions, paying attention to my daughter's cues. When my daughter invites me to be present, whether on a call or in a session with her children and their supports, first, being there to support her, following her cues, and speaking in turn, asking permission. Can I have permission to share something? Is that okay? Opposed to just saying, because a lot of times, I know for me, like as the parent, we're so used to the parent tells the children what to do, but respecting now her transition from my child to adult, now I have to respect her adult position and ask permission to share.
And again, I assume that's much easier said than done sometimes, especially when tempers flare, if there's behavior and you're in a public restaurant. And
Yes. And also, setting an example. If we're out and if someone, does decide that they want to make a comment or something, I want to definitely be that example to show, my daughter, especially understanding that, our kiddos, they have all this energy and they're really quick to want to defend. And so if I'm there and to be a role model, to smile and say to someone, oh, we're okay over here. Thank you so much for, your interest or being concerned and showing her the proper way of doing things. And so now that I am in my 50 plus years, and it's like the narrative of that fight, flight, and freeze changed for me. Even with the fight, learning how to fight with my words, not my hands now. You know, even with the flight, I'm not going to run to every fire. I'm going to let the younger ones go up there and wait my turn, or if I have a turn, and being able to even, differentiate that and say, okay, yeah, I need to move in now. Or like, no, I'm going to leave that alone. And so, and with freezing, I'm finding that I'm freezing a lot more now in my 50s than I did in my 20s. That was exciting. Got my adrenaline running, because I want to jump up and I want to run to things. And my revelations to say, I'm going to freeze more now and wait for that opportune time to want to, actually step in.
yeah, and just that with that role modeling is a responsibility, and to feel valid in your own self to have that responsibility too, I think is something that comes with the maturity and all of the experience that you've had.
To our glam parents, first and foremost, you want to maintain that glam, right? Don't let your children or grandchildren push you to a space where you can't be glamorous. Sometimes it's okay to step back, remove yourself from the situation, collect yourself, and then come back. That's first and foremost, because again, like as I was stating about the narrative of fight, flight, and freeze changing, we definitely want to practice and put that into actions. We are physically fighting. We learn now to fight with our words and how to be empowering others through our verbiage and what we say. And when we speak, we want to drop gems when we speak now. We want, if we want to talk about that fight, we want our blows to land. And so being very intentional and cognizant of what we're saying, how we're presenting ourselves, and again, freezing. Sometimes it's okay to freeze and wait for the opportune time. You don't have to move because everybody else is moving. You can be the only person at the table. That is okay. And just make sure that while you're sitting there, you maintain that glam, right?
I love it because I'm thinking of my buddy Jackie Bartell, who's been on the podcast many times. I feel like she's going to take that and be like, yeah, it's our new term for self-regulation, maintaining our glam, because it really is about maintaining your self-regulation. And we talk about that all the time in DIR, how important it is to really balance our FEDCs with that of the person we're interacting with, whether it be a client, a child, a partner, etc. So I love it. Maintaining our glam. You can drop that one at the ICDL conference
Awesome.
as a synonym for staying regulated. I love it. The first functional emotional developmental capacity in the DIR model. Shell, it's always a pleasure. I love having the DIR adjacent allies who share the same values and do the same work with different hats on and discussing all the different hats and navigating from the back seat. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
I want to say one thing
Yep.
to our parents. Just remember that you don't have to be a therapist to do something therapeutically.
Yes, that was another gem you dropped in one of our other podcasts. That's a good one. Absolutely. I will put all of the notes, including links to those past podcasts and resources we talked about. What the heck, I'll even put a link to The Glamorous Life by Sheila E., written with Prince. I'll put all of that at affectautism.com on the blog post for today's podcast. Again, thank you so much, Shell. Can't wait to see you and Kylil in person. And everybody else, stay tuned. Another podcast back in 2 weeks.
Well, thank you so much. And I love being a part of all of, this. And this is definitely a happy space and place in my journey. Thank you.